farmer notices that his chickens have started laying black eggs. At first, he thinks it's just a disease or a rare mutation, but soon realizes something far more sinister is happening. When he discovers the real reason, his blood runs cold. Subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching this video from. The morning always began the same way on Marcus Carter's farm. Long before the sun rose over the low hills of Green Hills County, before the first trucks groaned to life on the distant highway, he was already awake. The air carried the cool dampness of night, mixed with the faint scent of hay, rusted metal, and soil still breathing from yesterday's heat. Inside the small wooden farmhouse, a single bulb glowed over the kitchen table, casting soft yellow light on the chipped mug he always used. He drank his coffee in silence, no sugar, no milk, just the bitter taste that kept him steady. It wasn't habit anymore. It was a rhythm, the kind that built itself into a man's bones after years of repetition. When Marcus stepped outside, his boots sank slightly into the dew-covered dirt. The land stretched around him in quiet waves, fenced fields, weathered barns, a row of oak trees standing like old sentinels along the road. The roosters hadn't crowed yet. Somewhere in the distance, a cow lowed softly, as if speaking to no one. He liked this hour best, before the world woke up and before the thoughts came. He made his rounds with the same careful precision every morning. Checked the gate to the west pasture, tightened the latch on the feed shed door that never quite closed right, then walked to the chicken coops lined neatly in a row. Inside, the warm scent of straw and feathers filled the air. The hens rustled and shifted when he opened the door, blinking under the glow of a hanging bulb. Marcus spoke to them softly, a quiet hum more than words. He'd done it ever since Edna, his wife, told him chickens like to know your voice. It was something she had believed deeply, that animals, like people, could feel the difference between kindness and indifference. Edna had been gone for 6 years now, cancer taking her so quickly that Marcus still half expected to see her framed in the kitchen window when he looked back toward the house. She had been the one who dreamed up this farm, the one who said they'd live off the land, make something honest. He'd kept her promise, not because it was easy, but because it was the only thing left of her that he could still tend to. He crouched to collect the eggs, one by one, placing them carefully into a wire basket. The light was just beginning to shift to orange through the slats of the wooden walls. That's when he saw it. Nestled among the soft straw lay an egg that wasn't white or brown or even speckled. It was black. Not just dark, but pure, shining black, like it had been dipped in ink. He frowned, picked it up, turned it over in his calloused hands. It was heavier than the others, smoother, almost cold to the touch. He brought it closer to the light, expecting to see dirt or soot, but the color ran deep, all the way through. He set it aside on the edge of a crate. Probably a trick of the feed, he thought. Maybe something the hen ate. Chickens could surprise you like that sometimes. Still, the sight unsettled him. As he worked through the rest of the nests, he found himself glancing back at it again and again. It sat there, dark and perfect the way a storm cloud hangs too long over a clear sky. By noon, the farm had come alive. The sound of machinery from the neighboring fields drifted through the wind. Marcus loaded his truck with fresh produce, corn, beans, eggs, and drove into town. The same market he'd been visiting for over 20 years waited for him on the corner of Main and Franklin. Folks nodded at him out of politeness, though not many spoke much. He was respected enough, but still something of an outsider, one of the few black farmers who had managed to hold on to his land when so many others had lost theirs. He thought about mentioning the black egg to one of the other farmers, but decided against it. No sense stirring up talk until he knew what it meant. That night, after unloading, he returned home tired, his hands still smelling faintly of grain and metal. He made himself dinner: beans, cornbread, and the last of the pickled okra Edna had canned before she got sick. He ate in silence, the only sound the hum of crickets through the open window. Later, before bed, he sat on the porch. The black egg still rested on the windowsill where he had left it. In the moonlight, it seemed to glow faintly, reflecting silver off its dark surface. Marcus stared at it a long while, his thoughts slow and heavy. He'd seen odd things before: a calf born with 2 heads, rain in the middle of harvest. But this felt different. There was something about its stillness that gnawed at him. He finally carried it to the barn, set it on a shelf, and covered it with a cloth. The following days passed quietly. He didn't think much about the egg until the end of the week, when he found another one just like it. Then a third, all from the same white hen, Daisy, the oldest in the flock, the one Edna had hand-raised from a chick. Marcus started keeping the black eggs apart from the rest, setting them in a wooden crate in the feed room. He told himself he'd figure it out soon, maybe send one to the agricultural extension office in the city. But a part of him, the part that had grown cautious from years of hard lessons, didn't want strangers prying into his farm. Still, the sight of them unsettled him. Every time he lifted the lid of that crate, the dark shells seemed to absorb the light, swallowing it whole. He didn't touch them more than necessary. And at night, lying in bed, he sometimes thought he heard faint rustling from the coop, though when he went outside to check there was nothing but silence. The farm's routine never stopped. Animals didn't care about mysteries. They needed to be fed, watered, cared for. Yet Marcus began to feel something off in the air, a change so subtle it couldn't be named. The hens were restless, more irritable, pecking at each other without reason. The feed seemed to disappear faster than usual. Even the soil looked darker around the coop, as if stained by something invisible. He went through the motions, trying to keep order, but his thoughts circled the same question. He remembered what Edna used to say when the storms were coming. The land always knows first. Maybe that was true. Maybe the land was trying to tell him something. One night, unable to sleep, Marcus took a lantern and walked back to the coop. The smell of feathers and dust was thick, the floor littered with straw. The hens slept soundly, heads tucked under wings. He stood there a long time, listening to the quiet rhythm of their breathing. On a whim, he knelt beside Daisy's nest. There it was again, a black egg, still warm from her body. He held it close to the lantern, his own reflection warped in its surface. He thought of all the years he had fought to keep this land honest, to keep his word to Edna. He thought of every time someone laughed at small farmers like him, said the future belonged to big corporations and synthetic feed. Maybe this was what came of trying to stay clean in a dirty business. Maybe even the soil was tired of purity. When he placed the egg back down, he did it carefully, almost reverently. The light from the lantern flickered against the wooden walls, and for a moment the whole coop seemed alive with shadows. The hens stirred, murmuring softly, as if whispering among themselves. Marcus took a slow breath and stepped outside. The night air was cool, carrying the smell of damp grass and river silt. Above him, the moon hung low and round, pale against the dark sky. He looked out over his land, the barn, the fields, the line of oaks swaying gently, and felt both pride and unease. Something had shifted here, something quiet but deep. He couldn't name it yet, but he knew it had begun with that first black egg. He stood for a long time, watching the mist crawl over the pasture. The lantern light behind him threw a shadow across the dirt, long and thin, almost reaching the chicken coop door. Inside, the birds had gone silent again. The whole farm held its breath, as if waiting. Marcus finally turned off the lantern and walked back to the house, leaving only the moonlight to guard what slept. That night, he dreamed of the river behind his fields, dark and sluggish under a starless sky. In the dream, he waded in up to his knees and found the water thick and black as oil. Something smooth brushed against his leg, and when he reached down to pull it up, it was an egg, shining, perfect, and cold. He woke before dawn, the echo of the dream still clinging to him like humidity. When morning came, he did what he always did. He dressed, drank his coffee, and went out to work. The world outside looked unchanged, the same fields, the same gentle hills, but as he approached the coop, the first light of day caught something strange. Through the slats of the wooden wall, he could already see it, a dozen black ovals gleaming faintly in the straw. Marcus stopped, heart heavy in his chest. It wasn't one hen anymore. Every nest he looked at held the same impossible color. The farm was waking, but not in the way it used to. The silence he had always loved had changed too. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was expectant, holding its breath like the land itself was waiting for him to understand what he had done. He set down his basket, ran a rough hand over his face, and whispered to no one, "Something's wrong here." Then he opened the coop door wider, the hinges groaning in protest, and stepped inside, the smell of dust and feathers closing around him as the chapter of his ordinary life quietly came to an end. By the second morning, the black eggs were no longer a curiosity. They had become the rule. When Marcus stepped into the coop, the smell of straw and feathers seemed thicker, almost metallic. The hens clucked softly, shifting uneasily under the low yellow light. He moved slowly through the rows of nests, and everywhere he looked the same sight greeted him. Dark, polished shells glistening among the straw like pieces of obsidian. The white eggs he was used to seeing, small, warm, comforting, had nearly vanished. A strange hush filled the air, broken only by the occasional flap of wings. Even the roosters seemed subdued, as if the whole farm had entered some unspoken mourning. He gathered the eggs mechanically, his hands moving from habit rather than will, the basket filled with the same unnatural color, and with each one he lifted his chest grew heavier. He tried to tell himself it was a temporary sickness, maybe something in the feed or water, but deep down he already knew that explanation wouldn't hold. There was a weight in his gut that came from years of working the land, a kind of instinct that told him when something was wrong beneath the surface. That afternoon, he drove into town to pick up supplies. The road shimmered with heat, and dust clung to the sides of his truck. He stopped at Millard's feed store, where he'd been buying grain for nearly 2 decades. The old clerk behind the counter, a man with a white beard and a red cap, greeted him like always, though his eyes drifted to the faint smudge of black dust on Marcus's sleeve. "You been painting out there?" he asked. Marcus just shook his head, said it was nothing, and ordered his usual mix of feed and seed. He almost mentioned the eggs, almost asked if anyone else had seen anything strange, but something stopped him. Maybe pride, maybe shame, he couldn't tell which. He paid cash, loaded the bags, and left without another word. Back on the farm, the unease deepened. The hens had begun avoiding certain corners of the coop, huddling together near the walls as if frightened by something unseen. When Marcus scattered the new feed, they ate greedily, yet their movements were jittery and erratic. He knelt beside one of them, Daisy, again, and noticed her comb had turned pale, almost grayish. She looked at him with a glassy, unfocused stare that made his stomach twist. That night, Marcus sat on the porch long after sunset. The black eggs he'd collected rested in a crate near his boots. He hadn't taken them inside, couldn't bring himself to. The moon was out, swollen and bright, and its light made the eggs shimmer faintly, as if holding some dull inner fire. He thought about the first one he'd found days ago, how strange it had seemed then, almost beautiful in its novelty. Now the sight of them made him feel sick. He lit a cigarette, something he hadn't done in years, and watched the smoke curl upward into the dark. He tried to remember the last time he had seen something that unsettled him this way. Maybe back when he was a boy, growing up on his father's land in Alabama. His father had always said the earth had moods, days when it blessed you, days when it warned you. Marcus had never really believed in superstition, but he had learned to respect the soil, the rhythm of seasons, the quiet signals animals gave before storms. What if this was one of those signs, one of those moments when nature spoke in a language only the patient could hear? Over the next few days, the situation grew worse. The hens stopped laying entirely for nearly a day, then resumed suddenly, all at once, producing more eggs than ever, but every one of them black. Marcus weighed a few on his scale and noticed that they were heavier than normal, though when he cracked one open the inside looked nearly the same. The yolk slightly darker, the smell faintly metallic but not foul. Still, the sight turned his stomach. He threw that first one into the ditch and watched as it sank into the mud, leaving a black stain behind. By the 5th day, the news had begun to spread. Someone at the feed store must have mentioned it, or maybe one of the neighbors had glimpsed his crates. When Marcus drove into town again, people's eyes followed him differently. At the diner, the waitress who'd always kept his coffee warm now barely made eye contact. He overheard whispers from a nearby table, something about curses, chemicals, or bad breeding. In a small town, mystery always turned to suspicion, and suspicion turned to mockery, faster than truth could catch up. When he got back home, he found 2 teenagers standing by his fence, snapping pictures with their phones. They laughed when they saw him, sprinting off before he could reach them. Later that evening, one of the farm hands from a neighboring property called him the man with the devil's hens. Marcus tried to brush it off, but the word stuck. He began spending longer hours in the coop, as if by staying close he could somehow solve the mystery through sheer attention. He tested the water in the well, clear, cold, nothing strange about it. He sifted through the feed, found no mold or rot. He even changed the bedding in every nest, but nothing helped. Each morning brought more black eggs, each one perfectly shaped, unblemished, and wrong. Sleep became harder to come by. The nights were filled with odd sounds, scratching, fluttering, faint clucks that rose and fell like whispers. Once, near midnight, he thought he heard a soft crack, like a shell breaking, followed by silence so deep it made his ears ring. When he went to check, all the hens were asleep. He stood there in the dark, the lantern trembling in his hand, trying to convince himself it had been a dream. One afternoon, desperate for answers, Marcus walked over to see his neighbor, old Harold Green, who had been farming twice as long as he had been alive. Harold's property bordered his to the east, a wide stretch of pasture filled with cattle. The old man greeted him from his porch, a cigarette dangling from his lips, his face lined like carved wood. Marcus told him, haltingly, about the black eggs. Harold listened, frowning, then spat into the dirt. "You been messing with your feed, boy?" he asked. Marcus shook his head. Harold leaned back in his chair and said, "Well, that's what happens when you start trusting them companies. They'll sell you poison with a smile." Then he chuckled, as if to soften the warning, but Marcus heard no humor in it. Driving back, he kept turning that conversation over in his mind. Poison. He didn't want to believe it. The feed company he used had been around for years. Their bags bore government seals and glossy labels about sustainability and quality. Still, he couldn't shake the thought. That night, he went to the feed shed and opened one of the sacks he'd bought last week. The smell hit him immediately. Sharp, chemical, like burnt plastic mixed with metal. He closed it quickly and stepped back. Maybe he'd imagined it. Maybe it was just old feed, but something about it made his hands tremble. He took a handful and poured it into a bucket. The grains sparkled faintly under the light, a sheen that shouldn't have been there. He rubbed some between his fingers. It left a greasy residue, faint but unmistakable. He washed his hands twice, though the smell lingered. He thought of the hens eating it day after day, thought of Daisy's dull eyes. Sleep didn't come that night. Marcus sat by the window, listening to the low creak of the house and the distant wind moving through the trees. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the image of those eggs lined up in perfect rows reflecting the lamplight. He began to wonder if he was being tested somehow, if fate or faith was pressing on him to see what kind of man he really was. By dawn, he'd made a decision. He would stop feeding them from the new sacks. He'd use the old cornmeal mix instead, the one he ground himself. For 3 days he followed that plan, and for a brief moment he thought it might have worked. The hens grew calmer. Their feathers looked brighter. The black eggs stopped coming. On the 4th day, hope flickered back into his chest. Maybe it really had been the feed. Maybe the worst was over. But on the 5th morning, when he walked into the coop, the sight waiting for him turned that fragile hope to dust. The straw was littered with dark shells again, more than ever before. Every nest, every corner overflowed with them, their color deeper, their shine almost oily. The air smelled different, too, richer, heavier, as if filled with something unnatural. He stumbled back a step, gripping the doorway for balance. In that moment, Marcus understood that the problem wasn't going away on its own. Something bigger was happening, something beyond bad luck or tainted grain. The farm he had built with his own hands, the land he had guarded for years, was changing under him. And though he didn't yet know who was to blame, he knew he couldn't ignore it anymore. That night, as thunder rolled faintly in the distance, Marcus sat at his kitchen table staring at the wooden crate of black eggs beside him. He touched one, its surface cool and slick like river stone. He thought of the land, of Edna's words, of the way everything living gives warning before it breaks. Then he whispered into the silence, "It's not the hens, is it? It's us." The wind picked up outside, whistling through the cracks of the old house. He felt the floorboards tremble beneath his feet, as if the earth itself was drawing a long, uneasy breath. And as he sat there, surrounded by the quiet hum of the storm, he understood that whatever darkness had crept into his farm was no longer confined to the nests. It had seeped into the soil, the air, and maybe even into him, The storm that rolled in that night left the air smelling of rain and iron. Marcus woke before dawn, the sound of dripping water echoing from the roof. The wind had blown open the coop door during the night, scattering straw across the yard like pale feathers. When he stepped outside, his boots sank into the mud, and the morning light was thick and gray. He went straight to the hens, already bracing himself for what he knew he'd find. The black eggs were everywhere, half buried in the straw, their dark shells gleaming with beads of moisture. Even through the chill, a sour smell hung in the air, faint but wrong, as though the earth itself had soured. He gathered what he could, moving slower than usual, the basket growing heavy in his hands. The hens were restless again, pecking at each other, feathers floating through the dim air. He noticed Daisy huddled in the corner, wings drooping. Her eyes were dull, almost lifeless, and her breathing came in small, uneven bursts. He stroked her back gently, feeling the brittle bones beneath her feathers. "Come on, old girl," he muttered, though there was no comfort in his voice. She didn't move. When he lifted her head, it fell limp against his palm. By the time he left the coop, the sun had begun to break through the clouds, streaking the wet earth with silver. He carried the crate of eggs toward the truck, his shoulders bowed under the weight of something heavier than wood or shells. He had promised himself he would bring them to town, maybe ask someone what they meant, maybe find a buyer curious enough to take them off his hands. But as he loaded the crate onto the truck bed, he hesitated. What kind of man sold what he didn't understand? Still, he drove. The road was slick and empty, lined with puddles that reflected the wide gray sky. The market was already open when he arrived, the smell of fried food and diesel filling the air. The same men he had stood beside for years were already at their stalls, laughing, bargaining, calling out to early customers. Marcus parked at his usual spot and began unloading his produce. Heads turned as he opened the crate. At first, no one spoke. Then came the murmurs, rising like flies around meat. "What the hell are those?" someone said. Another voice, sharp, amused, followed. "You sure that's from chickens, Carter? Looks like something dug up from a coal mine." Laughter rippled through the row. Marcus didn't look up. He just kept unpacking, hands steady, jaw tight. The voices grew louder, playful but edged. "You sure you didn't make a deal with the devil out there on that farm?" someone joked. He forced himself to smile, but it came out hollow. He sold a few baskets of corn, some beans, but no one touched the eggs. Even the customers who had bought from him for years gave them wide berth. By noon, the crate was still full. When he tried to cover it, a young boy, one of the vendor's sons, darted up, reached in, and snatched one. His father yanked him back, shouting, "Put that down, don't touch it." The boy dropped it. It hit the pavement, cracked open, and rolled, oozing a slow, dark yolk that glistened under the sun. For a long moment, no one said a word. Then the laughter started again. Nervous this time, uneasy, but laughter all the same. Someone whispered, "Hexed." Someone else spat and walked away. Marcus packed up before the day ended, his hands shaking as he tied down the tarp. On the drive home, he didn't turn on the radio. The sound of tires over wet gravel was all he could stand. That night, the phone rang. It was Harold Green again. His voice was rough, like gravel being turned in a barrel. "Heard you took those things to town," he said. Marcus didn't answer. "Best you don't do that again. People talk. They don't stop." Then he hung up. Marcus sat at the kitchen table for a long while, staring at the receiver. Outside, the crickets had gone silent. The next morning, there was spray paint on his mailbox. Crude, hurried letters spelling out, Black Curse Farm. He scrubbed it off with steel wool until his hands bled, but the faint outline remained, ghostly against the metal. When he went into town again 2 days later, he noticed the stairs had changed. They weren't mocking anymore, they were wary. People crossed the street when he passed. At the diner, the waitress who once called him sweetheart now just nodded without meeting his eyes. He left a tip anyway. By the end of the week, the local paper had run a small story, just a few paragraphs buried on page 6. Farmer reports unusual egg phenomenon. They mentioned no names, but everyone knew. The next morning, 2 reporters showed up unannounced, one with a camera, the other with a notebook. Marcus met them at the gate, his hands in his pockets. "We're not open to the public," he said. The younger one smiled. "We just want to know what's causing it, Mr. Carter. Is it contamination? A mutation?" He shut the gate in their faces and walked away. That afternoon, he found more dead hens. 6 of them, lying near the trough, feathers ruffled as if they had been in a struggle. Their eyes were open, glazed over, the skin around their beaks dark. He buried them by the old oak tree behind the barn. When he finished, his clothes were streaked with mud and sweat, and his knees ached. He stayed kneeling there for a while, staring at the mounds of fresh soil. A part of him wanted to believe it was just disease, something natural, something that could be fixed. But another part, older, colder, knew better. As the days passed, he began to notice the ground around the coop changing. The grass had turned patchy and gray. The soil, once light and rich, looked darker now, almost black. Even the air felt heavier, thick with a faint metallic tang. He found himself avoiding that side of the property, though the work demanded he go there. Every time he stepped into the coop, the silence pressed down on him. The hens watched him from their corners, their eyes dull and distant, like creatures waiting for something they couldn't name. He thought of Edna constantly now. She would have known what to do. She always did. She had a way of calming animals, of reading their moods like a language. Sometimes, in the quiet hours, Marcus could almost hear her voice. "You have to listen to the land, Marcus. It talks if you're patient." But patience wasn't enough anymore. Whatever this was, it wasn't just nature turning sour. It was something done by human hands. He decided to burn the old feed that night. It seemed like the only thing he could control. As the sun sank behind the hills, he dragged the remaining sacks out behind the barn, tore them open, and poured the grain into a pile. He struck a match and watched as the fire caught, flaring bright before settling into a steady orange glow. The smell was acrid, chemical, unlike any grain he'd burned before. Smoke curled into the sky, thick and black. He stood there until the fire died, his face streaked with sweat and ash. But when he returned to the coop the next morning, the sight that greeted him nearly broke him. There were more black eggs than ever, dozens of them gleaming through the straw as though the fire had only fed whatever curse had taken root here. Marcus sank onto a wooden crate, his head in his hands. For the first time, the thought of leaving crossed his mind, selling the land, walking away, letting the rot take whatever it wanted. But the moment the idea formed, he rejected it. This was his home, his work, his promise to Edna. He would not abandon it to ruin. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone had done this deliberately. That night, he walked to the edge of his property, past the fields and down to the gravel road. In the distance, faint lights flickered from the valley. A chemical plant, maybe, or one of the new agricultural depots. He remembered the salesman who'd come by a month earlier, smooth-talking and polite, offering enhanced feed for trial use. The memory tightened his chest. He hadn't thought much of it then. He'd accepted the bags gratefully, believing in the promise of better yield. Now the thought made his stomach twist. He went back to the shed and searched for the sacks. Most were burned, but a few remnants remained, corners of thick plastic, faint logos smeared by soot. One corner bore a word still visible under the grime: AgroPure. He stared at it for a long time, the letters burning into his mind. Outside, the wind began to rise again, carrying the smell of rain and smoke. The night sky was dark and low, pressing down over the fields like a lid. Marcus stepped out of the shed and looked toward the coop. A single lantern glowed inside, flickering through the slats. The shadows moved with it, long and slow, as if alive. He stood there a long time, hands clenched at his sides until the light finally went out. Then he turned toward the house, his mind no longer filled with questions but with purpose. Tomorrow, he decided, he would find out the truth, no matter what it cost him. The next morning broke colder than it should have been for that time of year. Mist hung low over the pastures, dulling the colors of everything it touched. Marcus stood by the window with his cup of coffee gone cold, watching the fog drift through the oaks. He hadn't slept much. The memories of the night before, of the burnt feed, of the black smoke rising into the stars, of that name he had seen on the scorched plastic, had looped in his mind until dawn. AgroPure. He repeated it silently, as if saying it enough times might make sense of it. But all it did was make his gut tighten. When the light strengthened, he stepped outside. The ground squelched under his boots. The smell of wet ash still clung to the air. He walked first to the coop. The hens were already awake, shifting nervously in the straw. He had stopped expecting things to look different, but each morning still hit him like a small shock. The unnatural gleam of those black eggs, the lifeless quiet, the way the birds avoided looking at him. They knew something he didn't. He could feel it in the way they moved, restless but subdued, like prisoners waiting for release. He gathered the eggs carefully, though he wasn't sure why anymore. He didn't sell them now. They filled crates in the shed, useless and heavy. Maybe it was habit. Maybe he wanted evidence. He was starting to think he would need proof that he wasn't crazy, proof that something had been done to his animals. The word poison echoed in his head again, Harold's voice rasping through memory. He wiped the sweat from his neck and looked toward the feed shed. It stood apart from the other buildings, its roof sloped and rusted. The lock was still broken from the last storm. Inside, the air was damp, sour, thick with dust, and the smell of old grain. He switched on the lantern and saw the remnants of the AgroPure sacks in the corner. He knelt, brushed away the soot, and felt the texture of the fabric. It was synthetic, oily under his fingers. The remaining feed glittered faintly in the light, as though flecks of metal had been mixed into the grain. He lifted a handful and watched as the small particles caught the glow of the lantern like crushed glass. A slow anger began to build in him. It wasn't the kind that flares and fades. It was deep, deliberate, the kind that comes from being fooled. He remembered the man who had brought the feed, a representative from AgroPure, driving a spotless white truck with polished chrome and a logo that looked expensive. Marcus had been stacking hay bales that day, sweat pouring down his back. The man had called out, all smiles, saying he was offering samples of a new organic mix to local farms. Government approved, he had said. Cuts cost, boosts production. He had sounded like every salesman Marcus had ever distrusted, but there was something persuasive in his tone, and Marcus, tired and hopeful for once, had taken the bait. He could still see the handshake, the man's grip firm, his smile clean and hollow. He remembered the faint chemical smell that came off the sample bag when it tore open. He hadn't noticed it then, but now the memory stung. That was the day everything had started. The eggs, the sickness, the deaths. All of it traced back to that handshake. Marcus took a jar from the shelf and filled it with the glittering feed, sealing it tight. He'd bring it somewhere, someplace that could test it properly. He didn't trust the county inspectors anymore. They'd laugh at him, call it superstition. No, he needed people who knew science, not gossip. Maybe the agricultural college in Colfax. They had a lab, he'd heard. It was a long drive, but he'd done longer. He found a few empty cartons and collected several of the black eggs, too, wrapping them in paper to keep them from cracking. By the time he was done, the sun had burned away most of the fog. He loaded the samples into the truck bed, then paused, glancing back at the house. The place looked tired, the paint flaking, the windows dim. He thought of Edna again, of how proud she'd been when they bought this land, how she used to say it was alive, breathing through the seasons. If she could see it now, she'd be heartbroken. He touched the door frame before getting into the truck, a small gesture of promise. The drive to Colfax took nearly 2 hours. The radio faded in and out with static. He turned it off after the first half hour. The highway stretched long and empty, lined with fields that looked much like his own. Every so often, he passed other farms, larger, newer, with gleaming silos and company signs. AgroPure appeared again and again on the boards. Seeing it made his jaw clench. When he finally reached the college, the parking lot was half empty. Students drifted between buildings carrying notebooks and coffee cups, their laughter sharp and young. Marcus felt suddenly out of place. His mud-stained boots, his work shirt, the dust in his hair. He carried the jar and the eggs inside anyway, following the signs to the Agricultural Sciences wing. The lab smelled sterile, humming with the sound of machines. Behind a counter sat a young woman in a white coat, her hair tied back and her eyes half hidden behind glasses. She looked up when he entered. "Can I help you?" she asked. He nodded, setting the jar on the counter. "I need this tested," he said. She frowned at the jar, then at him. "Tested for what?" "Contaminants," he said. "Something's wrong with my chickens. They've been laying these." He set one of the eggs beside the jar. Her expression changed from confusion to disbelief. She picked it up carefully, turning it under the light. "Is this real?" "It's real," he said quietly. "All of them look like that now." She hesitated, then said she'd have to get clearance to run the tests. He waited while she disappeared into the back room. Through the small window, he could see her speaking with another technician. They both glanced at him more than once. Finally, she returned and took his information. "It'll take a few days," she said. "We'll call you." Marcus thanked her and left his number, though he doubted she believed a word he'd said. Still, the samples were out of his hands now, and that gave him a small sense of relief. The drive home felt longer. He kept replaying the conversation in his mind, hearing his own voice, unsure whether it had sounded desperate or determined. Maybe both. When he pulled into the yard, the sky was darkening again. The air was thick with humidity, and the frogs had begun their evening chorus by the creek. He unloaded nothing, left the truck as it was, and walked to the coop. The hens were quieter tonight, their movements slower. The smell inside was heavier too, a mixture of damp straw and decay. He found 2 more dead birds near the back, buried half under the bedding. He carried them outside and dug a shallow grave beside the others. As he shoveled, sweat dripped down his face, stinging his eyes. He tried not to think of what he'd do if the lab found nothing. What if the results said the feed was clean? What if it was something in the soil, or the water, or in him? He leaned on the shovel, breathing hard. The night insects sang louder. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, and the sound echoed through the valley. 3 days passed before the phone rang. The voice on the other end belonged to the same young woman from the lab, but now her tone was different, tighter, cautious. "Mr. Carter," she began, "we finished the analysis. We found some unusual compounds in the feed sample you provided." She hesitated before continuing. "High levels of synthetic hormones, and traces of heavy metals, cadmium, lead, and something else we couldn't identify. Definitely not natural." Marcus gripped the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. "And the eggs?" he asked. "The discoloration likely comes from internal bleeding in the hens," she said. "The compounds you've been feeding them are highly toxic. They're damaging the bird's organs from the inside. If those eggs were sold or eaten," she trailed off, "you need to dispose of them immediately." He thanked her, though his throat felt dry, and hung up. For a long time he stood there, staring at the silent receiver. Then he walked outside and looked across his land. The sun was setting, the sky streaked with gold and ash. The fields, the barns, the coops, all of it looked smaller now, tainted somehow. He felt anger rising again, sharper this time, no longer mixed with doubt. AgroPure had done this. They had sold poison dressed as progress. They had killed his birds and turned his farm into something unrecognizable. He went back to the shed, gathered the remaining sacks and stacked them by the fence. He photographed the logos, the feed, even the dead hens. Then he sat on the porch until the light faded completely. The crickets sang, the stars blinked faintly through the haze, and Marcus felt the familiar pull of exhaustion. But beneath it burned something steady and cold. He had the truth now, and that meant he had a weapon. He didn't yet know who would listen or how far he'd have to go, but he knew he wouldn't be silent. Not after what he'd seen. Not after what they'd taken from him. As the first fireflies began to flicker in the dark, Marcus Carter made a quiet vow that the people behind this would answer for it. The land deserved that much. And so did he. For the next 2 days, Marcus barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the black eggs lined up in rows, glistening like stones from some other world. The voice of the lab technician replayed in his head, the careful tone, the words toxic and internal bleeding. She had tried to sound calm, professional, but beneath the precision of her voice, he had heard fear. That was what haunted him most. Fear meant the problem went deeper than his small farm. The sun rose over green hills, red and heavy. Marcus sat at the kitchen table surrounded by notes, photographs, and the printed lab report that had arrived that morning by email. He wasn't used to paperwork. His world was built on dirt, not documents, but he forced himself to read every word, tracing the technical language with his finger until the meaning became clear. The feed contained substances banned for decades, hormonal agents that caused rapid growth in poultry but destroyed their organs in the process. There were traces of lead and cadmium far beyond any legal limit. Whoever had manufactured that feed had done it knowing full well what it would do. The anger that had been simmering inside him since the first black egg now solidified into purpose. He gathered the reports into a folder, added the photos of the dead hens and the burnt sacks, and placed it all in the passenger seat of his truck. He wasn't sure exactly where to go, but he couldn't stay still. Sitting there, watching the farm rot, felt like complicity. He drove toward town, the engine grumbling under the strain. The sky was pale and cloudless, the kind of day that made everything feel too bright, too exposed. The first stop he made was at the county agricultural office, a squat brick building beside the post office. Inside, the air was stale and smelled faintly of paper and coffee. Behind the counter sat a woman in a floral blouse who greeted him without looking up. When he told her he wanted to report a contamination, her smile faltered. "You'll need to speak to the inspector," she said, pointing down the hallway. The inspector's office was cluttered, stacks of folders piled against the walls. A man in his 50s, balding and red-faced, gestured for Marcus to sit. "So, what seems to be the problem?" he asked, already sounding tired. Marcus placed the folder on his desk and began explaining about the eggs, the feed, the company representative, the lab results. The inspector flipped through the papers slowly, grunting now and then. When Marcus finished, silence filled the room for a moment before the man spoke. "You're saying AgroPure sold you unapproved feed? That's a serious accusation." Marcus nodded, his voice steady. "It's not an accusation. It's proof." The inspector sighed, rubbing his temples. "Look, Mr. Carter, we've had complaints about bad feed before. Usually, it's storage issues or user error. Companies like AgroPure operate under strict regulations. If there's contamination, it's probably an isolated case." He pushed the papers back across the desk. "I can log your report, but these things take time. Weeks, maybe months." Marcus stared at the folder, then at the man. "By then, there won't be a farm left," he said quietly. The inspector avoided his eyes. "I'm sorry," he muttered, already reaching for another file. Back outside, Marcus stood in the sunlight, gripping the folder so hard his knuckles whitened. He had known they wouldn't help. Bureaucracy never moved fast enough for people like him. He drove straight home without stopping, the road stretching before him like an accusation. When he reached the farm, he didn't go inside. Instead, he walked to the coop and opened the door. The smell hit him immediately, sweet and rotten, the stench of decay. Another hen had died during the day. He buried it next to the others, the line of graves growing longer. That night, the silence was unbearable. The frogs had stopped singing. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Marcus sat on the porch with a single lamp burning beside him, the yellow light drawing moths that battered themselves against the glass. He thought of Edna again, of how she used to believe that evil always showed itself through small things, the taste of water, the color of leaves, the way animals behaved. Maybe she had been right. Maybe the land had been trying to warn him all along. The next morning, a different kind of determination took hold of him. If the local authorities wouldn't listen, someone else would. He drove into the city, to the office of a small independent newspaper he remembered reading years ago. The receptionist looked surprised when he entered, holding his folder like a weapon. After a few minutes, a young woman appeared, a reporter named Sarah who introduced herself with a brisk handshake. She listened while he spoke, her expression shifting from curiosity to disbelief to something like concern. When he finished, she asked to see the evidence. She read through the lab report twice, then looked up. "If this is true," she said, "it's a huge story." Marcus leaned forward. "It's not a story," he said. "It's happening. My birds are dying. I need people to know." Sarah nodded. "You'll get your truth," she said, but I'll need to verify the data. AgroPure's a big company. They'll deny everything." 2 days later, she called him again. Her voice was urgent, almost breathless. "I ran the company's registration. They've been under investigation before for pesticide contamination. It got buried. But if we can tie this to your case, it could reopen it." She asked to visit the farm and bring a photographer. Marcus hesitated, but finally agreed. When they arrived, the afternoon sun burned hot against the tin roofs. Sarah walked through the property, taking notes, asking questions about the feed, the symptoms, the timeline. The photographer moved silently behind her, snapping shots of the coop, the soil, the crates of black eggs. When they saw the graves behind the barn, Sarah's face hardened. "This isn't just negligence," she said quietly. "It's criminal." They left after a few hours, promising to publish within the week. That night, Marcus felt something he hadn't felt in months, a fragile thread of hope. Maybe, finally, the truth would reach beyond his fields. Maybe someone would have to answer for what had been done. 3 mornings later, the newspaper hit the stands. The headline read, "Toxic Feed Scandal. Local Farmer Exposes Corporate Negligence." There was a photograph of Marcus standing beside his coop, his face shadowed by his hat. The article laid out the evidence clearly, quoting the lab report, naming AgroPure directly. Within hours, his phone began ringing. Reporters, neighboring farmers, even strangers from other states. Some offered sympathy, others shared similar stories. One man from the next county claimed his cattle had been falling ill after switching to AgroPure's feed. Another woman said her pigs had stopped reproducing. By evening, the story had spread online. National outlets began calling. A representative from AgroPure released a statement denying all allegations, claiming the company had no record of distributing experimental feed. They suggested the contamination might have come from improper storage or local tampering. Reading the statement, Marcus felt his anger harden into something sharper. They were calling him a liar. He spent the next day gathering everything he hadn't already documented: emails, receipts, the handwritten invoice from the salesman's visit. He printed copies and mailed them to Sarah, along with a letter asking her to forward them to any federal investigator willing to look. That night, rain came again, heavy and sudden. It beat against the windows and soaked the fields, but Marcus stayed awake, listening. It wasn't fear anymore that kept him up. It was the sense that a storm larger than weather had begun. 2 weeks later, men in dark suits arrived at his gate. They showed badges from the Department of Agriculture and the Environmental Protection Agency. Their questions were sharp and deliberate. When he had received the feed, how many birds had died, whether he had spoken directly to any company representatives since. He told them everything, leaving nothing out. When they finished, one of them handed him a card. "We'll be in touch," the agent said. His tone was professional, but there was a flicker of respect in his eyes. The days that followed blurred together. The investigation spread quickly. AgroPure's facilities were raided, warehouses sealed. Television crews parked by the road near Marcus's farm, filming from a distance. For the first time in weeks, he noticed the hens acting differently. Still weak, but calmer, almost relieved. The air smelled cleaner, though maybe that was only his imagination. He started rebuilding small routines, feeding the birds, clearing debris, fixing the fence. The land, though wounded, seemed to breathe again. Late one afternoon, Sarah called. Her voice carried both exhaustion and triumph. "They found it," she said, "the same compounds in their central plant. Illegal growth hormones imported under false labels. You were right all along." Marcus didn't answer at first. He looked out over the pasture at the sun dropping low and the faint shimmer of life returning to the grass. "What happens now?" he asked. Sarah hesitated, then said, "There'll be trials, fines, maybe prison for some of them. And you, Mr. Carter, you're the reason it's coming to light." After she hung up, he sat in silence. The cicadas hummed in the trees, their song rising and falling like waves. He thought of all that had been lost, the birds, the trust, the quiet life he'd once known. But he also thought of what had been gained. Truth, no matter how painful. He had exposed something meant to stay buried, and though it had cost him dearly, he knew he wouldn't have done it any other way. That night, under the faint glow of the moon, Marcus walked down to the graves behind the barn. He knelt in the dirt, pressed his hand against the soil, and whispered, "It's over now." The wind stirred through the grass, soft and cool. For the first time in months, he felt the land breathe easy again. The days following the government raid on AgroPure passed with a strange quiet that felt almost unnatural. The noise of reporters, the endless ring of phones, the churn of panic and vindication, all of it slowly faded. But beneath that silence, something deeper was shifting, like a current turning beneath calm water. Marcus could feel it every time he stepped outside. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and change. He had thought the hardest part was over, that exposing the truth would bring closure. Instead, he found himself in the middle of something that refused to end neatly. His farm, once a place of simple work and quiet dignity, had become a symbol. Reporters called it the epicenter, the place where one man's persistence had unraveled a corporation's lies. But Marcus didn't feel like a hero. He felt hollowed out. He'd lost most of his flock, his soil was poisoned, and every inch of his land reminded him of how easily trust could be betrayed. He spent mornings rebuilding the fences that had fallen in the storm. But the work felt different now, less like maintaining life and more like guarding what was left of it. One morning, a black SUV rolled up the dirt road, stopping by the gate. Marcus wiped his hands on his jeans and walked toward it, half expecting another journalist. But when the door opened, he saw a man in a gray suit and dark sunglasses. The man introduced himself as Agent Russell from the Department of Justice. His voice was calm, clipped, and official. "Mr. Carter," he said, "we'd like your continued cooperation. The investigation has expanded beyond AgroPure. There are distributors, shell companies, and foreign suppliers involved. We need your testimony." Marcus felt a flicker of unease. "You mean I'll have to testify?" he asked. "In court," the agent said, "when the time comes." He handed Marcus a card. "Until then, keep every document, every photo, every record. It'll all matter." Then he added, with a tone that almost sounded personal, "You did the right thing. Don't doubt that." After the car drove off, Marcus stood by the fence for a long while, staring out at the horizon. The fields were starting to show signs of recovery, the first shoots of grass pushing through the poisoned patches, small birds returning to the trees, but the wounds ran deep. Every scar in the soil mirrored the exhaustion in him. He wasn't sure what the right thing meant anymore. Right things were supposed to make the world better. All he'd done was peel back a layer of rot. A week later, he received a letter from another farmer in Oklahoma, written in neat block handwriting. The man thanked him for speaking up, saying his own flock had started dying after switching to the same brand of feed. He wrote that the local feed supplier had ignored his complaints until Marcus's story broke. "You gave us a voice," the letter said. "Before you, nobody listened." Marcus read it twice, then set it beside the others. There were dozens of them now, letters from farmers across the country, from small towns and isolated communities just like his. Each told the same story in different words: blackened eggs, dying animals, tainted soil, indifference from those in charge. The realization hit him slowly but deeply. This wasn't an isolated crime. It was systemic, a chain of negligence and greed that had stretched farther than he could imagine. Sarah visited again that month. She arrived in her old blue sedan, the same one that had rattled down his road the first day she came. Her eyes were tired but sharp. "The case is growing," she said as they sat on the porch, sipping sweet tea in the humid afternoon. "Federal prosecutors are preparing charges. The company's CEO has been subpoenaed, and the investors are scrambling. They're calling it one of the largest agricultural frauds in decades." Marcus listened quietly, his gaze on the fading line of the hills. "And what happens after?" he asked. Sarah hesitated. "That depends on people like you," she said. "If you testify, if you stay visible, it keeps the pressure on. If you disappear, they'll bury it again." He nodded slowly. "I'll be there." Still, the nights grew long. Sometimes he woke to the creak of the windmill or the distant hoot of an owl and felt the weight of everything pressing down on him. The land was alive again, but no longer felt like it belonged entirely to him. Reporters and investigators came and went, turning the place into a landmark of someone else's story. But when the sun rose and he stepped outside with his coffee, the smell of wet straw and soil reminded him of the life that still clung here. Months passed. The hearings began in the city courthouse, and Marcus found himself sitting under bright lights, facing men in expensive suits who avoided his eyes. Lawyers for AgroPure tried to twist his words, suggesting he had mishandled the feed, stored it wrong, fed his hens improperly. But the lab reports, the photos, and the testimonies from other farmers drowned out their denials. When he spoke, his voice was steady, his words simple. He told them what he had seen, what he had buried, what he had lost. Outside the courtroom, reporters crowded around him. Microphones hovered near his face, cameras clicked. One asked, "Mr. Carter, do you feel vindicated?" Marcus paused before answering. "I feel tired," he said quietly, then walked away. Back on the farm, the changes were slow but visible. He'd started planting wildflowers around the hen yard, hoping they would draw bees back to the property. A local environmental group had offered to help test his soil and restore it. Volunteers came on weekends, students and activists who said his story had inspired them. He didn't know what to say to that. Inspiration wasn't what he had wanted. He just wanted to survive, but something in him began to thaw. One morning, while cleaning the coop, he found an egg that wasn't black. It was pale brown, small and fragile, but clean and normal. He held it in his hand for a long moment, feeling the faint warmth against his skin. It was the first real sign of life returning, the first quiet victory. He placed it carefully in a basket, almost reverently, and carried it back to the house. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the fields gold, a pickup truck rolled up the drive. It was Harold, his old neighbor, who hadn't spoken to him in months. The old man climbed out slowly, hat in hand. "Heard they got those bastards," he said, his voice rough. "'Bout damn time." Marcus nodded, smiling faintly. Harold looked around, taking in the repaired fences, the clean air, the faint sound of hens clucking again. "You did good, boy," he said. "You made 'em listen." After he left, Marcus sat on the porch until the stars came out. The crickets had returned, filling the night with their familiar hum. He thought about the word good. It sounded simple, almost naive, but maybe that was what made it worth something. Doing good wasn't about winning. It was about holding ground when everything tried to push you off it. Weeks later, Sarah called again. "The verdict's in," she said. "The executives were found guilty. The company's finished. The government's seizing their assets for cleanup and restitution." Marcus exhaled slowly. The words felt distant, almost unreal. "It's over then," he murmured. "For them, maybe," she said, "but you've got work ahead. They're offering you a grant to restore your land. The EPA wants to use your property as a pilot site for soil rehabilitation. You could help set a model for others." After the call, Marcus walked the length of his fields. The earth was softer now, rich with promise again. He knelt and let the soil crumble through his fingers, dark and damp. For the first time in over a year, it smelled right, alive, breathing, forgiven. The following morning, he rose before dawn as he always had. The world outside was wrapped in mist, just like that first morning when all this began. But now the fog felt different. It wasn't hiding something sinister, it was cleansing. The hens stirred quietly in their coop. A few clucked as he passed, their voices soft but steady. He stopped by the oak tree where the small graves lay and knelt. The grass had grown over them now, green and thick. He placed his hand on the ground and whispered, "We made it." The wind brushed through the branches, gentle as breath. He stayed there until the sun broke the horizon, then stood, dusted his hands, and turned back toward the farmhouse. The fight had changed him in ways he couldn't yet name. He had lost his innocence about the land and the people who profited from it, but he had also gained something that felt closer to peace. Truth, he realized, wasn't clean. It scarred everything it touched, but it also cleared the rot, left room for new growth. When he reached the porch, he saw the small basket on the table. Inside it lay the brown egg from the day before, gleaming softly in the light. He smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening. There would be more eggs soon, more mornings like this. The world would keep turning, wounded but still alive. He poured himself a cup of coffee and stood watching the mist lift over the fields. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel the weight of the past pressing down on him. The land was healing. So was he. The first light of spring crept across the valley, soft and golden, washing the fields in quiet warmth. For the first time in over a year, Marcus Carter woke to a silence that wasn't heavy or foreboding. It was gentle, alive, full of promise. The air carried the faint scent of wet earth and wildflowers, and the low hum of bees drifted from the edge of the pasture. He sat up slowly, the floorboards creaking beneath his bare feet, and for a moment he just listened. There were no sirens in the distance, no reporters at the gate, no restless thoughts clawing at the edges of his mind. The storm, both literal and otherwise, had finally passed. When he stepped outside, the sun had risen high enough to paint the world in color. The oaks shimmered with new leaves, their branches stretching outward like arms freed from a burden. In the coop, the hens stirred lazily, clucking in that familiar rhythm that once marked his mornings. Their feathers were glossy again, clean and soft, and the smell of straw no longer carried the acrid undertone that had haunted him for months. He opened the door, scattering the feed, a mix of corn and grain he'd milled himself, and the birds rushed toward it, pecking eagerly. The sight made his chest tighten in a way that was both painful and peaceful. Near the trough stood the old oak tree where he had buried the poisoned hens. Grass had covered the ground there, a lush carpet of green that swayed in the morning wind. He walked to it, his boots sinking into the damp soil. For a moment, he knelt and pressed his hand to the earth, feeling its warmth. He could still remember the weight of each small body, the smell of decay, the anger that had driven him to dig. But the land no longer felt cursed. It pulsed now with a quiet strength as if forgiving him for not seeing the truth sooner. "We're all right now," he whispered. "You can rest." A soft voice behind him startled him. "Talking to your trees again?" It was Sarah, leaning on the gate, her hair pulled back, a half smile on her face. She had come early, unannounced but not unwelcome. He rose to his feet, brushing dirt from his knees. "They listen better than most people," he said, smiling faintly. She walked closer, looking around at the fields. "It's beautiful here," she said. "I almost didn't recognize it." He nodded. "It's starting to come back." They walked together along the fence line, past the restored garden beds and the patches of wildflowers that had begun to bloom near the creek. Sarah told him that the cleanup programs had already started in 3 other counties, modeled after his case. Farmers were being compensated, land was being restored, and AgroPure's name was gone from every supply chain in the region. "They're calling it the Carter Reform," she said, glancing at him with a hint of amusement. "You're famous now." He laughed softly, shaking his head. "I didn't want fame. I wanted peace." "You earned both," she said. "Maybe not the way you expected." Later that afternoon, after Sarah left, Marcus sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the horizon. The wind carried the distant sound of a tractor, his neighbor Harold's probably. Life had returned to its rhythm, steady and unremarkable in the best way possible. He could see it now, the way time stitched things back together, not perfectly, but honestly. The scars on the land, the lines on his face, they were proof of survival, not signs of defeat. The grant money from the government had arrived weeks earlier, and he'd already used part of it to rebuild the barn roof, replace the broken well pump, and install solar panels Edna had once dreamed of. He kept her photograph on the windowsill inside, framed in wood she had polished herself. In the picture, she was smiling beneath that same oak tree, sunlight glinting in her hair. Every time he passed it, he nodded, as if to let her know he was keeping his promise, that the farm was still alive, still honest. As the evening settled, he walked down to the pond. The water reflected the sky in soft hues of amber and blue. A pair of ducks glided across its surface, leaving ripples that spread slowly outward. He sat by the bank, the smell of damp grass filling his lungs, and let himself think of everything that had brought him here. The fear, the exhaustion, the anger, it all felt distant now, like a bad dream whose edges had faded with time. Yet it had changed him in ways that were permanent. He knew now that goodness wasn't quiet compliance. It was resistance, persistence, a refusal to let the truth drown in silence. He picked up a small stone and skipped it across the water, watching it bounce once, twice, before sinking. The ripples widened, intersecting with the reflection of the sky. "Everything comes back around," he murmured. He wasn't sure if he meant it as comfort or warning, maybe both. The next day, a delivery truck arrived with a new shipment of young hens. Marcus unloaded them carefully, one by one, placing them in the freshly cleaned coop. They chirped softly, still unfamiliar with their new home. He crouched beside them, speaking in the same low tone he used years ago when Edna was alive. "You'll like it here," he said. "Good earth, clean water, no lies." He smiled at the sound of his own words. They were simple, but they felt sacred. Weeks passed, and the seasons began to turn again. Spring deepened into early summer. The fields glowed with green, and the air buzzed with the sound of cicadas. Each morning brought a small miracle, white and brown eggs, smooth and perfect, waiting in the nests. Marcus collected them gently, as if each one carried not just life, but truth itself. The first time he sold them at the local market, the same people who had once mocked him greeted him with nods and smiles. One man clapped him on the shoulder and said, "Good to see you back, Carter." The words were plain, but they carried weight. He returned to the farm with an empty crate and a full heart. On the drive home, he passed the sign he had made years ago. The paint had faded, but the words were still legible. No chemicals, no lies, only truth. He stopped the truck, got out, and ran his fingers along the wooden letters. The surface was rough but strong. He decided he wouldn't repaint it. The weathering was part of its honesty. That night, he sat on the porch under a blanket of stars. The crickets sang, the frogs called from the pond, and somewhere in the distance an owl hooted. The world felt whole again, not perfect, but alive. He thought about everything he had learned, the greed that had poisoned his land, the apathy that had allowed it, and the quiet strength it took to stand against both. He realized then that truth wasn't something you found once and held forever. It was something you tended, like soil. It needed care, patience, and the willingness to get your hands dirty. As the clock neared midnight, Marcus rose and walked to the edge of the field. The moon hung low and bright, casting long shadows over the grass. He could see the faint outlines of the old graves beneath the oak, now covered in wildflowers that swayed gently in the breeze. He stood there for a long time, breathing deeply, letting the night wrap around him like a promise. When he finally turned back toward the farmhouse, dawn was already stirring on the horizon. The first light touched the fields, setting them aglow with silver. The hens began to stir, their soft calls echoing across the yard. Marcus smiled, his breath clouding faintly in the cool air. Another day was beginning, and with it, another chance to do things right. He poured fresh water into the trough, scattered feed for the hens, and watched as they moved in a calm, rhythmic dance. The world was simple again, just the way he liked it. Before heading inside, he looked once more toward the gate, where his old wooden sign caught the morning light. It glowed faintly, the words standing out against the rising sun. "Only truth," he whispered. "Always." And as he stepped back into his home, the land behind him shimmered in the full brightness of morning, alive, restored, and honest once more. If this story kept you watching till the end, hit that subscribe button right now, because the next episode will leave you speechless. Don't forget to share this video with your friends, and check out the other stories waiting for you on the channel.